Let's be real. In every organization, there's this invisible architecture of power. It's not built on performance, not really on merit, but on a hidden current of human psychology. It's a blueprint for who gets ahead that's rarely ever talked about, but, we all feel it. Today, we're going to deconstruct this system, piece by piece. We are mapping out the architecture of organizational favoritism, not as some simple character flaw in a leader, but as a predictable, systemic process that has its own logic. All right, let's begin the diagnosis.
So this quote right here, this is the central paradox we're digging into. It's this wild idea that getting ahead isn't always about your output, but about your reflection. It kind of suggests the game is rigged, right? Not through some evil plan, but by a deep-seated biological need for what's familiar. This is basically social identity theory at work, our primal need to sort the world into us and them. And being the leader's reflection, well, that makes you the ultimate us. It validates their own identity, and that's often way more valuable than just being good at your job. So what's the force driving this whole thing? Well, we call it neurological gravity. I want you to think of it like a subconscious tractor beam. When a leader looks at an employee and sees a younger, hungrier version of themselves, or maybe an idealized version of who they wish they were, this invisible, powerful bond just forms. This has nothing to do with logic. It's all about making things easy for the brain. See, our brains are wired to save energy, and dealing with someone who thinks and acts just like you takes way less effort than dealing with someone who challenges you. This pull is powerful, it's often irresistible, and it can easily override any objective performance data. And when someone figures out this whole neurological gravity thing and decides to exploit it, that becomes what we call a surgical affinity hijack. Now, this isn't just about being friendly with the boss. No, this is a strategic process. It's deliberately manipulating what organizational science calls leader-member exchange theory, which basically says leaders form these high-quality in-group relationships with just a select few. The hijack is when someone strategically engineers their way into that in-group. They weaponize the leader's natural need for similarity directly against the organization's need for actual performance. And that creates the affinity trap. And that, right there, is where meritocracy starts to systematically break down.
All right, here's our roadmap for this whole diagnostic. We're going to start with a symptom you can actually see, the mirror trajectory. Then we'll diagnose the problem it creates, the meritocracy mirage. From there, we'll dissect the core pathology, what we call the architecture of tribal capture, before looking at its cellular mechanism, the neurological weapon. And finally, we'll assess the damage with the institutional costs and deliver the prescription. Own the metrics.
So let's start with the pattern you can actually see, the symptom that tells you something is deeply wrong with the system's logic. This is the mirror trajectory itself. The path of that favored person as they just shoot up the ranks, seemingly defying the normal laws of corporate physics.
Okay, this slide gets right to the core conflict, down at a primal brain chemistry level. A leader's brain filters information through a super simple ancient lens, threat or partner. So an expert who brings in challenging data or a different opinion, they represent the outgroup. Their competence can actually trigger a cortisol response in the leader, a feeling of stress, of being challenged. But the favorite, the person who offers agreement, familiarity, they are the in-group. They trigger an oxytocin response, the chemical for bonding and trust. So the leader isn't consciously choosing an amateur over an expert. Their biology is unconsciously choosing a comforting ego anchor over a strategically vital but potentially threatening asset.
So, if that's the symptom, what's the diagnosis? Well, it's the reality for everyone else in the organization, the meritocracy mirage. It's that confusing, disorienting feeling that the rules you were told to play by, work hard, get results, be the expert, suddenly, and with no explanation, just don't apply anymore. And that is the beginning of moral atrophy.
We've all seen this happen, or maybe even felt it ourselves. It's what we call the sudden freeze. It's that chilling moment of clarity for a top performer, when they finally realize their expertise, their data, their results, none of it matters as much as someone else's political connection to the leader. It's a moment of just profound cognitive dissonance, where your entire model of a rational organization just shatters. The system itself is practicing what's called induced competence discounting. It's actively devaluing real talent in favor of tribal loyalty.
This really nails the fundamental shift that happens inside the system. The official goals of the company are quietly replaced by the unspoken psychological needs of the leader. And the crazier part? The more an expert tries to prove their value with hard work and data, the more they accidentally shine a spotlight on the favorite's weaknesses. This just amps up the expertise threat, causing the leader to double down on their bad decision, which is a classic case of confirmation bias. To feel better about their choice, they just retreat further into the comfort and safety of their favorite, making the broken system even stronger.
Which brings us to the core of our analysis, the pathology. We're now going to look at the precise, repeatable mechanics of how this favoritism gets hardwired into the very structure of the organization. This isn't random, it's a methodical process. This is the architecture of tribal capture.
This capture happens in 4 distinct phases. It kicks off with the mirroring strike, then it moves into the shadow data phase, it gets reinforced by evaluation shielding, and it all ends in a structural monopoly. This is the systematic process that takes meritocracy apart from the inside. This is where the integrity breaks. Phase 1 is the mirroring strike, and this is a highly strategic act of psychological reconnaissance. The potential favorite doesn't just give out vague compliments. No, they identify a leader's specific insecurity or a point of unacknowledged pride, their specific ego need, and then they validate it, reinforcing the leader's belief in their own hidden genius. What they're really doing is building a detailed neurological map of the leader's self-concept and then positioning themselves as the #1 source of psychological safety, the ultimate anchor of validation. So once that connection is established, the leader opens the gate to phase 2, the shadow data phase. They start testing the favorite's loyalty, sharing confidential info, complaining about other people, giving them a heads up on new projects. This creates a powerful biological reward system called dopaminergic exclusivity. You know that little rush you get from feeling in the know? That triggers a dopamine hit, which cements loyalty and creates this feedback loop of dependency. It also gives the favorite a huge temporal advantage. They have information that allows them to make moves before anyone else even knows what's happening.
So once a leader is invested in someone, their brain works overtime to protect that investment. This is phase 3, evaluation shielding, and its core mechanism is the attributional hijack. This is confirmation bias on steroids. When the favorite inevitably makes a mistake, the leader's brain just reframes it as bad luck or bad timing, but when they have a tiny, accidental success, it's blown up and called a masterstroke. The leader's brain is actively hunting for data that confirms their great judgment and just closes the file on any evidence that proves them wrong.
And all of this leads to the end game, phase 4, the structural monopoly. The favorite is now so trusted that they become the primary filter between the leader and reality. They control the flow of information, deciding what data and which people get access to the leader. This is the moment that tribal logic completely takes over. Power doesn't come from performance anymore, it comes from proximity. The leader might be the body, but the favorite has become the brain, managing reality itself and creating a massive strategic blindness for the whole organization. Okay, so we've dissected the how. But why is this system so powerful? Why does it work even inside supposedly rational, data-driven companies? To get that, we have to zoom in on the cellular mechanism, the neurological weapon at the heart of this entire dynamic.
This is the fundamental question. In a world that claims to value accuracy, efficiency, and results, why does the comfortable, easy answer so often win out over the correct, difficult one? The answer isn't in our spreadsheets, it's in our evolutionary biology.
Here is the core conflict, laid bare. Our brains evolved for tribal survival, not for maximizing quarterly profits. Our brain's default setting, its low energy state, is to seek comfort, agreement, and familiarity. That's the bias of homophilia. That's the oxytocin reward of being with your in-group. The organization, on the other hand, needs correctness, challenge, and performance to survive. So favoritism is really just the institutional result of what happens when the brain's preference for comfort steamrolls the organization's need for correctness. And of course, we've created sophisticated corporate language to justify this biological urge. How many times have you heard the term culture fit? More often than not, it's a convenient, plausible-sounding shortcut for tribal exclusion. The person making the decision uses it to resolve their own cognitive dissonance. You know, the discomfort of knowing they picked someone less qualified by telling themselves the favorite has some intangible soft skills. The decision maker is basically being chemically managed by their own brain's primal need for comfortable agreement.
Okay, so let's zoom out from the individual psychology to the institutional level. What is the long-term corrosive damage of this system? What's the prognosis for an organization where favoritism has basically become the operating system?
The #1 indicator of systemic rot is something called public outcome disconnection. This is that critical moment when the organization's external results, its market share, product quality, revenue, are telling a completely different story from its internal hierarchy of who gets promoted and rewarded. It's the ultimate red flag of institutional decay. This is the point where you have to shift your focus from just working harder to developing audit awareness, the ability to see and measure this disconnect for yourself. And this disconnect creates the indispensability paradox, which is a deeply imbalanced and, frankly, operationally suicidal state. The experts, the very people who sustain the business with their contributions, are exploited and sidelined. Meanwhile, the favorites, whose main contribution is to sustain the leader's ego, are protected and promoted. The organization becomes dependent on the very people it ignores to prop up the people it rewards. This is the engine of talent decay.
So what's the ultimate inevitable consequence of this paradox? Talent flight. The most valuable people in your organization, the experts, are faced with a simple, brutal choice. Stay here and be an engine for someone else's unearned success, or leave and become sovereign and control your own destiny. When enough of them choose to leave, the leader finds out way too late that you can't buy results with affinity. The organization, stripped of its actual competence, is finally forced to face the harsh, objective reality of the market.
So, having diagnosed the system, we finally get to the prescription. Given this deep-seated biological and systemic reality, what's the antidote? It's not a tactic for office politics. It's a fundamental shift in perspective. It's an intellectual weapon.
Here's the final choice. You can spend all your energy fighting the mirror, trying to be liked, trying to become the reflection the leader wants to see. And you know what? In the short term, you might even win the room. But true, lasting authority comes from somewhere else entirely. It comes from owning the metrics. It means focusing on being objective, undeniable, and indispensable, based on the cold, hard data of reality. That is how you own the future.
This awareness, this is the weapon that collapses the whole system of captured merit. Understanding these mechanics isn't about learning to play the game better. It's about realizing you should be playing a different game entirely. So the takeaway from this entire diagnostic is this: stop fighting the mirror. Own the metrics.